While the Allies despised German machine guns in World War II for their blistering rates of fire, the Germans in turn feared the brutal power of the M2 Browning and its .50 BMG cartridge. It didn't earn nicknames like Meat Chopper and the Deuce for nothing. The full story, however, is darker still, and, as you might expect, more gruesome after a hit from one of those rounds. So let's rewind and explain why and how what would become the M2 was developed. In World War I, it became clear how crucial effective machine guns were, but back then machine guns fired the same ammunition as infantry rifles. As armored planes and tanks began to appear, the need for rounds with heavier punch became apparent. General John Pershing specifically demanded a new machine gun capable of destroying those targets much more effectively than the .30 caliber weapons then in service. The task went to John Browning, America's most famous gun designer. Browning was given requirements for a gun that would fire a half-inch round at over 2,700 feet per second, a major jump from anything he had built before. He essentially scaled up his reliable M1917.30 caliber water-cooled machine gun to accept a much larger cartridge. That cartridge was itself a scaled-up version of the .30-06, developed to be rimless for smoother feeding, and it drew some inspiration from captured German 13.2mm anti-tank rounds. The result became the .50 BMG, 12.7 by 99mm, a cartridge that would soon prove one of the most effective ever created. After rounds of testing, the first prototype entered production as the M1921, a water-cooled heavy machine gun intended mainly for anti-aircraft use. Early trials, though, were not encouraging for other roles. Infantry found it too heavy to carry. The water-cooled version weighed about 120 pounds, the lighter air-cooled model around 84 pounds, with a tripod adding roughly 44 pounds. A complete ground setup could weigh between 130 and 170 pounds plus heavy ammunition. Substantial recoil made accurate firing difficult. Smaller aircraft struggled to use it, and mounting it in early small vehicle turrets was awkward because it could only be fed from the left side. Initially, its only real role was as a coastal anti-aircraft gun, but everything was about to change. Browning died in 1926, yet development continued, and his design was refined. Internal parts were altered so feed could be quickly switched between left and right by changing the top cover. A universal receiver was developed that could accept either a water-cooled barrel with jacket, a heavy air-cooled barrel, or a light air-cooled barrel for aircraft use. With these improvements, the concept became promising. The weapon received the designation M2 Browning. While other nations moved toward heavier 20mm or 30mm cannons, the Americans believed the .50 caliber's high velocity and adaptability would remain effective, and so it stayed in production. How effective it would be became clear when global conflict resumed. By World War II, the United States fielded M2s in multiple roles: fixed aircraft guns, shipboard anti-aircraft mounts, bomber and vehicle installations, and tripod-mounted infantry setups. It proved effective against nearly anything encountered on the battlefield. Early on, its greatest use was on aircraft with lighter barrels and a tuned rate of fire raised from around 500 to roughly 1,200 rounds per minute. That nearly matched the German MG-42's rate of fire, but the M2 was used in short bursts, necessary because aircraft and anti-aircraft windows are brief. In some aircraft configurations, the M2's volume of fire was astonishing. The B-17G Flying Fortress carried up to 13 minutes and 2 seconds in twin mounts across various turrets. The P-47 Thunderbolt had 8 per wing, and the Douglas 26 Invader could mount as many as 18, 8 in the nose, 4 in each wing, and 2 in the turret. The M2 was a major step up from earlier .30 caliber guns, offering a balance of rate of fire and single-round power more than sufficient to down fighters or bombers and to slice through engine blocks with armor-piercing ammunition. Multiple M2s firing together posed a grave threat to anything on the battlefield. American fighters strafed locomotives, armored vehicles, and even tanks effectively. Roof armor is often thin, and the heavy barrel M2 quickly became standard on tanks and vehicles where feasible. By 1945, millions of M2s had been produced, making it one of the most produced machine guns in history, and German forces were frustrated by the ubiquity of American heavy MGs. Low-flying attackers like Stukas faced much greater risk because jeeps, half-tracks, and tanks almost always carried a .50 caliber. On many tanks, the M2 was mounted on the rear of the turret and fired by a soldier standing on the engine deck, so it could be elevated against air attack, although that gunner was exposed outside the tank's protective armor. Before we look at battlefield effects, a quick technical note. Browning's barrel recoils rearward after firing because the M2 uses short recoil operation, where barrel and bolt lock together and move rearward as a unit on firing. That supports the cartridge case while chamber pressure remains high, preventing rupture during extraction. After traveling roughly 10 millimeters, the barrel stops, and the bolt continues rearward to extract and eject the spent case, compressing the recoil spring. The spring then pushes the bolt forward, strips a new round from the disintegrating belt, chambers it, and fires again, repeating the cycle while the trigger is held. So why did German soldiers fear the .50 so much? First, American doctrine increasingly relied on overwhelming firepower, which terrified the Germans who suffered ammo shortages. Anything on wheels or wings often carried at least one heavy machine gun in American formations. A .50 caliber hit is not comparable to smaller rounds. The .50 delivers between 5 and 10 times more energy than most infantry weapons. Concrete or brick walls that once provided protection could be penetrated, or sustained bursts might collapse sections of wall or shred sandbag emplacements. Even heavier tanks like the Panzer IV could suffer rounds slipping through from side or rear hits, have optics or tracks damaged, or experience turret jamming. Light Japanese tanks in the Pacific were frequently knocked out by .50 caliber fire, particularly during banzai charges where American tank crews poured everything into them. One controversial aspect is the myth that the .50 was banned by the Geneva Conventions because of its horrific effects on the human body. That's a myth. Nonetheless, the physical damage from a .50 hit is devastating, often causing catastrophic loss of limbs or death. Witness accounts convinced German troops of its brutality. Tactics adapted. Assaults shifted from direct assaults to targeting M2 positions with snipers, tanks, mortars, or artillery. Germany simply lacked an equivalent infantry heavy machine gun. Their wartime heavy MGs were the MG-42 and MG-34 on the Lafayette tripod, which were superb but fire the 8mm Mauser round with nowhere near the energy of the .50 BMG. The closest German counterpart was a 13mm heavy machine gun used on fighters, and though they captured and occasionally used M2s, even producing copies of .50 rounds, actual German use was limited. Now for some frightening M2 modifications and the ammunition types employed. Standard ball full metal jacket rounds were destructive, but specialized variants multiplied the M2's roles. Armor-piercing rounds could penetrate around an inch of hardened steel. Incendiary rounds ignited flammable materials and were especially effective against aircraft fuel systems. Combined armor-piercing incendiary rounds and armor-piercing incendiary tracers gave both penetration and visibility for adjusting fire at range, useful when engagement distances extended beyond a kilometer or two. Typical belts had a tracer every fifth round for ground use, while aircraft belts mixed armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds to suit air combat or ground attack missions. Post-war developments produced even more exotic ammunition. The Ralphos multi-purpose round combined a tungsten armor-piercing core, a small explosive, incendiary components, and fragmentation, behaving much like a 20mm shell in a .50 package. The Sabot light armor penetrator uses a subcaliber dense penetrator, often tungsten, to greatly increase armor penetration. It's effective against light armor and helicopters, but is costly and more commonly used in bolt-action or semi-auto anti-material rifles than in full-auto M2s. The .50 BMG's power also inspired dedicated sniper platforms. Carlos Hathcock famously mounted a telescopic sight to an M2 for single-shot long-range engagements in Vietnam, influencing later anti-materiel rifles, such as the Barrett M82. No history of the .50 would be complete without the quad .50. When a single heavy MG wasn't enough, for mounted on a single electrically traversed platform, the M45 quad mount, originally intended for mobile defense against low-flying aircraft. One problem with the single M2 was its relatively low rate of fire and the short engagement window against fast targets. Multiplied by 4, the volume of fire became far more effective. Electrically driven turrets could traverse quickly and elevate to 90 degrees, and the mount could be ground-based or vehicle-mounted. Later in the war, with Allied air superiority, quad .50s were often turned to ground support, and the concentrated effect of many .50s on a single point was devastating. The concept survived into Korea and Vietnam, and creative truck-mounted quad .50 setups even protected convoys from ambushes. For .50 gunners in World War II, the weapon delivered immense firepower, but also painted a target on their backs. M2 positions drew immediate enemy attention due to their distinctive report, smoke, and muzzle flash. Early vehicle and tank-mounted .50 gunners often lacked protective shields, remaining exposed to small arms fire until losses and urban combat force changes. Shields became standardized later. Far more protective solutions arrived with powered turrets and remote weapon stations like the Crows, letting gunners engage with a joystick and cameras from within the vehicle using laser rangefinders, night vision, and thermal sights. Modern mounts are designed to work with .50s as well as other machine guns and automatic grenade launchers. The M2 Browning's journey from an initially unpromising heavy gun to a ubiquitous and enduring weapon is remarkable. With only incremental upgrades, the most visible being the M2A1's improved barrel change system, flash suppressor, and manual safety, the core design from a century ago persistently proves useful. Like the MG42's updated descendants, the M2 exemplifies how an older design can remain relevant. But the M2 is literally older still, with roots in World War I, and it shows no sign of retirement anytime soon.